It is 11:30 a.m., Tuesday, the 24th of October, and on behalf of Dave Nagel and me, David Gauci, I welcome all of you who have joined us today for the 11th talk in the Business and Energy series of Forum 2100. The talk today takes us along a new line of discussion and perhaps could be categorized under the question, how to make things happen in responding to challenges of changing climate. We are very fortunate to have as our guest today, Merribel Ayres. Please go to the Forum 2100 website to review what Merribel has accomplished over a distinguished career in the energy space. To give you a sense of how engaged she has been, it is noteworthy that she began working on climate problems as a participant in the first known US Forum on Climate in October 1980. She has been a consultant to government and industry energy. She comes to us today from her home in Milan, Italy. Merribel, welcome to Forum 2100. I am going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the lovely introduction. So, Dave, and listeners, I welcome this opportunity to reflect on the climate legislation of the 2009-2010 period when congressional leaders and the White House had attempted to pass a bill in the first term of the Obama administration. I've chosen the title Untold Story because I am so often surprised by the Sunday morning quarterbacking among journalists and others who have created narratives around the failure, or shall we say, inability to reach the goal line in the 2009-2010 congressional term, when we had a Democratic White House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House of Representatives. I actually was fortunate to have a ringside seat as the political advisor director for the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. And we'll tell you a little bit more about US CAP in one of the coming slides. But speaking of a ringside seat, I chose this image because while we are always tempted to use the vocabulary of pugilism when speaking about legislative campaigns, it's not a particularly useful way to comprehend fully the motivational landscape of elected officials. And it is a mistake, in my view, to be too caught up in the virtue signaling of your side or my side when it comes to the many influences on a politician's decision about voting for or against a piece of legislation that can have significant long-term impacts and unintended consequences on his or her constituency. Now the curtain opens. I prefer the form of a theater rather than a boxing ring, because in effect, the major players involved are indeed actors. And in this case, I've listed here the primary kind of clusters, groups of actors. We're going to be talking shortly about the White House, the Congress, and the U.S. Climate Action Partnership in particular. And we get to US CAP, it is indeed kind of a proxy for talking about the business community and the environmental community. Today, in our short time, we really don't have the opportunity to go into the other stakeholders, labor, religious groups, etc., but they were important partners in the debate at the time. Next slide, please. If we look at the executive branch titans of the times, we see a group of people who universally embraced President Obama's avowed commitment to renewable energy and his belief in the need for a federal bill to reduce carbon emissions. With the benefit of 2020 hindsight, let's focus on the top row, or we will be focusing on the top row, beginning with the president, what he said and what he did. Carol Browner, his choice as a climate czar, a choice made in large part to satisfy his political base, which included the environmental community. And Rahm Emanuel, who as chief of staff for the White House was a man with clear priorities. Equally important, we must move to the Congress, and probably even more important to the dynamics of this legislation. Next slide, please, David. Well, not all of you will recognize all the figures on the screen. Several are retired from Congress. Some are now deceased. But there's a few particular items to note. John McCain is on this slide because as the presidential contender, Republican contender against Barack Obama in the 2008 elections, he was a great supporter of climate and a long-term supporter of climate legislation. And it was one of the reasons we all thought that our time had come for, the time was ripe for a legislative vehicle, is that both presidential contenders were supportive of this type of legislation. John Dingell of Michigan and Rick Boucher of Virginia were very important players. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. But the third thing I'd like you to see as you look on the slide is the distribution between California, the West Coast, and Massachusetts, Connecticut on the East Coast. So in the House, we saw Henry Waxman of California as chairman of the very powerful Energy and Commerce Committee. Ed Markey was also on that committee. Ed Markey is now a senator, and the legislation during that period of time was called, in the House, was called the Waxman-Markey bill. So its branding as West Coast and East Coast was not really helpful to bringing in the rest of the country, and particularly the center and the Midwest. We also add to that the chairman of the Senate Environment Committee, Barbara Boxer, also from California, you see on the right side. Joe Lieberman, who was a critical figure, and John Kerry, also again on the East Coast. Lindsey Graham is on this slide because he played an important role as a moderate Republican, as did John Warner, who is now retired. Next slide, please. The U.S. Climate Action Partnership, the reason that I've been invited to give this presentation. Well, this was really an unprecedented coalition of business and the environmental NGO community. There really hadn't been anything like it around a major piece of legislation that had been formalized in this way. And if you look at the list, you'll see approximately 25 major corporations and 5-6 major environmental groups. People came in and out at different times, so the numbers were not always static. But the thing to understand is that within the business community, you see electric utilities, independent power producers, you see chemical company like Dow, manufacturing companies, you see automotive companies, and of course you see the petroleum sector as well with BP and ConocoPhillips. See some consumer products in there and food with Pepsi, Cola, and I'll leave it to you to sort of let your eyes cast over this slide. And then there's the Natural Wildlife Federation, Natural Resources Defense Council, Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, World Resources Institute, et cetera, et cetera. And this group came out with a pledge to action in 2007, and then in at the end of 2008, a blueprint for legislative action, and put the issue. It gave the Congress from both the business side, the NGO side, a sense of a strong constituency that was really motivated to pass legislation at this time. Next slide, please. Now, as you may know, or as you probably all know, the legislation did not pass. We went through the House with an extremely narrow margin. There were very few Republicans who voted for the bill. The vote was 219 for, 219 for, about 212 against. I might not have that number precise, but it's pretty close to it. And the bill never actually got to the floor of the Senate. So let's take a moment to understand why, according to my views, which probably may or may not be shared with others involved at the same time. But I welcome the opportunity to give you my insights. As you see, the first is be careful what you wish for, a coup in committee leadership. So when President Obama came into office and Nancy Pelosi was again House Speaker, and the Senate was Democratic as well, there was a reshuffling of who would be chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. This is very important because John Dingell had been chairman of that committee when the Democrats had the majority for many, many years, decades. Henry Waxman and John Dingell, different parts of the country, had always had their conflicts. Really, with the benefit of having Speaker Pelosi in the chair, really had a coup, and they did a vote within their own caucus, and Henry Waxman prevailed. And so instead of the bill having the name Dingell Boucher, which was Michigan, and then Boucher was a subcommittee chair of Virginia, the new branding, so we went from the Midwest, Michigan, the South, Virginia, a coal state, and instead of having that branding on the supporters as a support for a climate bill in the House, we suddenly had two very liberal names, California, Massachusetts, Waxman Markey. So in hindsight, one would say, in a way, I say, be careful what you wish for, because I think obviously the Environmental Committee really did want the end game to be a legislative victory, but I don't think this helped us along the way. Similarly, when the president appointed Carol Browner as his she was a longtime environmental advocate, had formerly been administrator of EPA during the Clinton years. And when she was made climate czar, we call that sort of shorthand for advisor to the president on energy and climate, that certainly satisfied his base, the environmental community. But again, in hindsight, as committed as she was to these sets of issues and as strong her background was, she was really not the best person to go up and negotiate with the Midwest. And we had to have the Midwest to pass something through the Congress. It might have been better if the president had appointed a liberal Republican, former senator, former House member, or a conservative Democrat from the Midwest in that job. It would have made the business of the White House being represented on Capitol Hill go a little more smoothly. The third important factor was, in this case, and we don't really know why, although President Obama never sent legislation up to the Congress, his own bill. And that had typically been done for major environmental legislation. For example, George Bush, when he wanted to do the acid rain bill, he sent, in the 1990 period, he sent a bill up to the Senate as a starting point. It became the White House bill. This never happened. None of us knows why, but I think it really, it left everything up to Congress, and I'm not sure that it served the goals of the White House as well as it might have as if they were willing to send even an outline up to the Congress. The fourth item on this slide is the narrative. And the truth is, economy-wide cap and trade was always difficult to talk about. And we just didn't do a very good job of speaking about it in shorthand. And it's a complex issue. It involved a lot of economists and lawyers, but still we could have worked harder on the narrative. And what we tended to do, certainly within US CAP, was to really debate words among ourselves and policies among ourselves. And we probably would have been wise in hindsight to have done a more effective external communications campaign. We'll continue the lessons learned with the next slide, please, David. Regional issues matter maybe even more than party issues on this kind of a major piece of legislation. And I already referred to this by mentioning in the Midwest, where we had a lot of Democratic senators. We could not, House and senators, it was hard for those people to be on this type of legislation. And it's just something to keep in mind. This is not just about R&D by any means. Nimbleness, the ability to recognize that you're not going to get all of you want, and that was particularly hard to be nimble in a large coalition. And being able to find what's the center, what people can agree on, and what might be pragmatic versus ideological, all important and all difficult to do in the heat of legislative dynamics. Next slide, please. Now, in one of those moments of truth is stranger than fiction, in October 2010, when we were already having a lot of challenges on the Senate side with getting a bill to the floor, the New Yorker ran a very extensive article. And the source for the article was a staffer who worked for Senator Lieberman of Connecticut, who was one of the major players in the legislation. She was a young staffer, graduated Yale Law School, and she probably hadn't had a lot of experience in dealing with the press. And Ryan Lizza did an excellent job of going through a full analysis of what was happening behind the scenes in the White House. But it was not a good thing that all of it came out on newsstands. And it was kind of the nail in the coffin in the debate. And then you see his title right there. He anticipated how the Senate and the White House missed their best chance to deal with climate change. So that the timing of that was not optimum, but it's great when you go to teach at a place like the Harvard Kennedy School or the business school and what went wrong, and it's all out there with Ryan's article. Next slide. So the real question is, what does history teach us? How does the past inform the future? One thing I would like to highlight, I referred to briefly, is that the major environmental laws, Clean Air, Clean Water Acts, and have been ironically passed by when Republican presidents were in the White House. And I think the thing to look at there is the importance of bipartisanship, that it's almost likely to be more successful when the president does not have the White House and the House and the Senate to have the triple crown. It makes the president have to work a little harder to get to that bipartisan support. Let's move swiftly to when will the next opportunity emerge, because I want to be sure we have time for questions. It's good news is that absent federal policy, big progress is being made. And the driver on this, there are a couple of drivers, but when you look at the numbers of the amount of renewable or clean energy that has come online, a big driver has been large customers. The Walmarts, the Facebooks, the Targets, Caesars, General Motors, large customers of electricity who want to sort of hedge their own costs on having a diversified fuel mix. And they, of course, like to brand with clean energy. So there's some statistics here that the driving force is large customer demand, with 194 companies having joined the Renewable Energy 100 pledge. That's sort of 100% renewable energy by a certain time, or making all the effort to get to that certain time. The other factor is, because of the customers, red states have been motivated by economic development, not necessarily about ideology. And so over the past few years, Nevada, Nebraska, and Utah are some of the states who have really had the most attractive tariffs for bringing in clean energy, for developing clean energy and bringing in economic development for some of the major data companies and other companies to move to these states. So that's been a surprise along the way. This is an interesting slide from the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and they have been tracking the amount of, in their case, renewable energy transactions and deals. You will see a lot of them, of course. Some of them are with major manufacturing or chemical facilities, and others are with consumer brands, with technology companies. But it's a slide after the fact, if you're interested in this subject, worth studying. As we talk about renewable energy, I do want to make one other point that, in my own view and the view of many others, renewable energy alone will not get us to a carbon-free world. And that while renewable is definitely a pillar in the generation mix of a carbon-free world, we really need to look also beyond renewables and consider sort of a suite of other technologies, which would include nuclear, would include that, obviously extremely low carbon, no carbon technology, would include hydroelectric, would foster the development of clean CCUS, clean coal utilization technologies, and carbon reduction technologies. And in order to get to that zero carbon world, we will truly need all of the above.
Merribel, let's see, we're probably a little bit out of time here, but I want to make sure we get some questions in.
Yes.
This is quite a story that you have woven here. And I want to go back to maybe one of the slides that early on that gives the composition of this partnership. It's quite remarkable, I think, in terms of who's in here. And certainly if you look at it, just look at the industry side, this is quite a, I don't know how to say it more elegantly, hodgepodge of players, which you have alluded to. So when people look at the energy industry or industry-related companies, I would not be surprised that they probably assume that they're a kind of like-minded monolith. What's your impression? How did the companies actually interact with each other? You go from electricity generation to automobile manufacture, mining, and so forth.
So, excellent question, David. They had a shared goal in terms of how to get there and what was in each of their own interests to get there in a way that the costs and benefits were well aligned in their respective industries. They had different points of view, and we spent an enormous amount of time, but always with goodwill internally, with a lot of goodwill and trust, I felt, in the coalition, of working on these issues. I mean, there was a considerable amount of work done on the policy components for many, many months before it actually moved into legislation, and a huge amount of preparation. So, but even within, let's say, the electric sector, you might have a company that has a low carbon footprint, like an Exelon, because it had a lot of nuclear generation, and a company with a higher carbon footprint, such as Duke Energy in North Carolina. And there was a good deal of even negotiation within certain sectors, even within the oil sector, there would have been some difference of opinions. And this was extreme. This was also true in the environmental sector. So it was like, being the conductor of an orchestra. And sometimes we hit sour notes, and sometimes we were all singing off the same sheet of music. But that was the work of the coalition. And it was remarkable how much we stayed together. And the coalition was actually together for about 4 years. Prior to the Obama administration was active in the Bush administration. Yes, there were times where we lost people, that people said, no, I can't be, no hard feelings, but we need to leave. We can't go along with something. But
well, along these lines, to follow this up, I mean, could you say just a little bit more about the relationships on the one side, the NGOs that are represented, which look like fairly significant players, with the companies that were assembled in this partnership? Was it a legitimate sort of dialogue between the two camps?
Yes, very much so, because this didn't just happen overnight. Several of these NGOs had made it a point for years of having dialogue and relationships with the business community. The Pew Center on Global Climate was a business organization. It now has a different name called C2ES. But it was not a situation, as I said before, of, bad guys versus good guys, people understood each other's motivations. And I say motivations, I don't mean personal motivations. I mean constituency motivations, whether you're CEO of a corporation or whether you're head of an environmental organization that has a particular profile or character to it. There was a huge amount of mutual respect, because it was a shared end goal, a window of time that we thought gave us possibility. And, but of course, a lot of work on the different paths forward of how do you get things done, how do you, the give and take. Now, I will say that once the proposal that had been developed by Congressman Dingell and Boucher in 2008, which was tight and nice and climate focused, once that got jettisoned when the committee was renamed, when the new bill was Waxman-Markey, and when Congressman Waxman, when Henry Waxman took over the chairmanship, that really expanded into a huge piece of legislation that went way beyond climate per se and made it more and more complicated for us to keep our coalition together as well, at least in my opinion.
Two questions to follow on this that probably relate more directly to business interests. You've shown that in the last 2 slides, I think it was, there's been significant growth in corporate renewable deals within the US power sector. And this has happened even with no price on carbon in the United States. So it'd be interesting to know, what do you think is driving this growth? And, do you have a sense as to whether or not customers are paying a premium or not versus traditional power costs?
So I'll do that a little bit backwards. The cost of renewables has come down, and also states that want to encourage this are involved in kind of developing what we call sort of tariffs for clean energy and renewable energy. But I think, a lot of people who are more involved in the pricing of this can be more informative than I, but I think all would agree that the cost of renewables has come down significantly. And of course, a lot of things have happened in the energy world, like the shale gas explosion meant that the cost of, that we replaced a lot of coal with what turned out to be a cheaper resource with the shale gas, something that we hadn't anticipated. And very often, of course, gas is a backup for renewables.
Right. Merribel, unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but this is fascinating, and we've recorded this session. So thank you very much for all of this. And there's quite a bit here to sort of, I think, chew on.
Okay.
Let me invite people to go to the website. We will have this posted on YouTube within the next day. And please join us for our next talk, which will be Tuesday, the 19th of November at 11:30 Eastern Standard Time and 5:30 Central European Time. The topic is an unusual one, but it's a major one. It's Introduction to Military Operational Energy. Our guest will be Dr. Paul Sullivan, who is on the faculty of the National Defense University and has been on the faculty for the last 20 years. He's a specialist in energy, economics, and international relations. Has been working all around the world with militaries, not just in the United States, but in Asia, in South America, and in Europe, and in Africa. So please join us then. On behalf of Dave, Nagel, and me, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Please look for the archive on the website and on the YouTube channel. Until next time, all the best to you. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.